Edinburgh-based tech company. It stands for Old Scots for sure and trusted. And I'd like to talk a little bit about driving up social value and my belief that registers are a really useful tool in doing that. So social value seems to be billed today as a cure for all society's ills. It's been codified through things like TOMS, themes, outcomes, and measures. There's really good work going on in that area from the likes of the Social Value Portal. There's 5 themes: jobs, growth, social, environment, and innovation, and 18 outcomes and 38 different measures. The government says it will monitor these outcomes to assess the effect of what they describe as these commercial interventions. So that's social value. Registers are lists of information. Each register is the most reliable list of its kind. If you work in a service team, using a register will mean you're only ever working with one reliable current source of data, and that's its value. And there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of registers across the UK public sector. So the expectation seems to me that social value will be derived from modifying large commercial contracts, e.g., the TOMS being committed to winning the contract to build a school or an airport or whatever it might be. But such delivery relies on lengthy supply chains standing up to the individual commitments. And what about the social enterprise and charity sector, whose core purpose has been delivering TOMS long before the term was invented? Where do they fit into this picture? So my argument is to build back better is that shared registers should be used rather than databases. Shared registers build trust based on a single version of the truth. So what I'd like to do is just talk for 10 minutes about my sort of experience from the beginning to the end of my career, hopefully to stimulate some discussion after I finish and maybe some questions and answers and so forth. So I started my career in the early 80s, and the most significant job, worthwhile job that I had at that time was in Zimbabwe, in post-independence Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe got their independence in April 1980, and there was a tremendous thirst for education, and there's a lot of UK aid being pumped into the country, and one of the things that were addressing was expanding the size of the university from 12,000 students when I joined to 7,500 when I left 3 years later. I wouldn't say databases were non-existent, but you didn't have modern fourth generation type databases, Oracle and so forth, and SQL. There's an earlier version. So the thing that we use is called IDMS, which was the peak of my technical career. I had quite a good understanding of IDMS, and I was employed as a database administrator there. And we implemented a system that ran through applying students, registered students into the bursar's office, student accommodation. And I suppose the whole thing sort of came to a critical point around exams at the end of the year. And as I explained, the university is expanding very rapidly. There was a lot of new lecturers coming in, new courses, new buildings, and a lot more students. So scheduling an exam diet over 2 or 3 weeks is quite a challenging task. It relied on good information. You couldn't ask students to sit the same exam at the same time, and you couldn't ask students to go along to an exam venue that could seat 100 people if there was 120 people turning up. So that was the responsibility of the exams officer in the whole process, and she was relying on the accuracy of the data that a woman, and Muti, who ran the register, had sort of put together as people changed courses and so forth. That was a difficult task, and at that time involved a printout every night. It started off about 2,000 pages and reduced to 200 and reduced to 20 pages. And at the end of the day, she did have a very hard job, but it was a couple of pages, and she had to get the schedule right so everything worked. That simply couldn't have been done without having a database system, and it all worked well. So what I learned from that experience was the real power of having a single canonical version of the truth, a clear understanding of who was responsible for maintaining different parts of the data. And all that happened within the organization. I'll come back to that later. But databases are very powerful things. And since then, probably through all of your careers, you've experienced more from my early experience. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is in the late 90s and early 90s when I volunteered with the Samaritans. At that time, there was a realization that many young men were more likely to consider, who were considering suicide, to use email rather than the telephone. And the phone was the way, with volunteers, that was how all our calls came in. A few people popped in, but mainly it was over the phone. And at that time, the Samaritans were run entirely by volunteers, which I found really impressive. So, for example, I did a monthly overnight stint as well as a number of day shifts. And I did that with a guy called John Laurie, who was an Edinburgh fund manager. But he also ran, or what he would say facilitated, the whole UK organisation. And during that time, I was fortunate to be one of a small team that made this change from, we still did the telephone, but being accepting of emails, which, if you can imagine, is quite a different thing. You might talk to someone for a few minutes or indeed a few hours on the telephone, but interacting with someone by email is a very, very different thing, full stop, but certainly around about the year 2000. So we managed to implement that with a team of 120 volunteers, ranging in age from 18 to 80. And everyone had to commit to working in this new way. I think we lost half a dozen of our volunteers. So what I learned from that was the power of civic society to do good, I suppose alternative management models, and the ability for voluntary organisations to implement really transformational change. At that time, I was sort of a middle manager in a large corporation, and managing change and all that stuff was very much on my agenda. And the Samaritans gave me a very, very different insight into that. So jumping forward to what I've been involved in much more recently last year and this year, is we've been doing some work with the Ministry, or ultimately for the Ministry of Justice in the UK, and that's around helping voluntary organisations describe what they do in a consistent way, so that social prescribers or referrers can find them and understand the services that they offer. And that, at the moment, there's multiple databases or registers or whatever you want to call them, that are held by local authorities, by charities themselves, and they're very hard to maintain. There's no single source of truth. The third sector and the social enterprise organisations are very diverse in size and so forth. So it's a real problem. So we've done some good work in an alpha version that's been tested at the moment to allow people to do that in a consistent way. And the other piece of work we've done is up here in Scotland with the NHS, looking at how we can reduce delayed discharge from hospital. And there's quite, a bit lumpy, but there's quite well established sort of processes in terms of moving people from hospital into what I would call statutory care provided by the council, and quite often subcontracted to third parties, to commercial organisations. But there was no formal method at all to move beyond what I've just described in terms of being able to find an organisation that can help, and actually sharing data to allow them to accept the referral and give them the information they need to provide the service. So our work there focused on a charity called Food Train, and people, older, elderly people were brought into hospital for whatever reason, who were found to be suffering malnutrition, which sadly is not an uncommon condition today, particularly for elderly people that live alone. And being able to, the hospital discharge unit, being able to send basic details about the discharge date, the postcode, and the patient's condition, to allow Food Train to accept the referral, and having accepted the referral, to get more information about the patient to provide the service, and indeed allowing Food Train to measure the person's level of malnutrition and write that to the register so that hospital and community dietitians can see the patient's process. So that's sort of the ancient history of databases, my experience in working with the third sector, and my more recent experience in trying to get to a position where there's a common understanding of services available and help organisations collaborate better together. So my reflections and all of that are, databases are brilliant, but that was like 20th century, and we're in the 21st now. Databases don't solve the problem of collaboration between organisations. particularly where they inhabit different IT, legal and cultural domains. The fundamental problem is lack of institutional trust to allow collaboration through the sharing of data. Existing government registers are very well established, hundreds of them, and the definition talks about each register is looked after by one person known as the custodian. The custodian is the organisation responsible for the information in the register. They make sure the register is up to date. And my argument is that we need to move to a position where it's not one organisation, it's multiple organisations, and we need to control the way the data is used, the granularity of access to that data, to allow everyone to give confidence in its veracity. So we need to move beyond these static registers, using shared registers to bridge the gap between organisations and create private trust networks. These will facilitate collaboration through data sharing and drive increased social value. That's what Secure provides. I suppose my question is, do you believe that's what's required?